Hey everyone, how's it going? It's Nick here, and yeah, today we're gonna make some more brayers. So it's been about 9 months since I made my last one, and I just had all the stuff still lying around, and I thought, well, maybe I'll make another brayer because I'd hate to just let it all kind of go to waste. I already have all the tools and stuff like that. Maybe I'll make a brayer for my friend or so. But now I have a 3D printer, which can give me a lot more precision and a lot more options of how to make brayers. So after a bunch of trial and error, this is what I've kind of solidified as the best way I think it is to make the most optimal brayer using 3D printing. Let's get to it. First up, you're going to need a tube for the mold. I like this clear acrylic tube because it's very smooth on the inside and it lets me see how much rubber I've poured into it. I'll leave a link to it below. I get nothing from that link, I'm not affiliated with them at all. Next up, you're going to grab some screws, and so here in America we've got some weird, imperial screws. I've got here some number 10s, and they're 1 inch long, although they could be a little bit longer, but I found that this is good enough. Next up, we're going to have our polyurethane rubber, and so it's the same rubber that we used last time, the RioFlex 30. You can get this from Dick Blick. I actually haven't really been able to find it anywhere but Dick Blick and the Smooth On website. Next, we're going to need our colorant, and so here I have this So Strong Black, although you don't have to have color, you could just have it be flesh colored. That one's up to you. They do sell a lot of colors. Next up is the mold release, which is very important because I have found that you cannot get these out of the tube without mold release. And of course, you'll need some 3D printer filament for a 3D printed brayer. Here I'm just going to use some PLA. I've got this nice yellow color. It comes in lots of fancy colors. The world is your oyster, and that's why I really like this project, because you can customize it as much as you want with whatever colors you want. Of course, you'll need a 3D printer to go with it. I'm using the Anycubic Cobra 2. It cost me a little bit over $200, but it's very easy to use. If you don't have a 3D printer, there's people on Etsy where you can kind of commission them to print your things for you, and there's other online 3D printing services. Next, you'll need a measuring cup, and so I like this one because it has marks down the side that tell you how much milliliters or ounces you currently have in there. And I've been kind of reusing this one for a long time. I think you're supposed to dispose of them, but I keep cleaning it and reusing it. After that, you'll need some tools like this box cutter, one with a really long blade, a good Phillips head screwdriver because we're going to need some torque, and some mixing sticks. Gloves are also nice, but I forgot to show them on camera. Alright, so let's talk about the design for a little bit. And so what I made was a core, basically. And the beautiful thing about 3D printing is that you can make it to any size that you want. And so with my last brayer that I made, I was forced to use a wooden core to kind of use less rubber, but I couldn't get one that was like, the exact size that I wanted. And so I ended up with 1/2 inch of rubber around the outside, which was really heavy because there was so much rubber, and it used up half of the kit of rubber, a little bit over half of the kit of rubber, so I could get like one brayer from it. But with 3D printing, I can give myself a really thin wall of rubber, and that way I can maximize the amount of brayers that I make with the rubber kit that I have, while still having enough rubber to make a really good brayer. And it's already got the holes in there in the exact center, so really cool. Then I didn't really know what I was going to do for the handle, and so I ended up getting this strip of brass, similar to what I did last time, but I was going to make it kind of like a tackish brayer where it can sit on the table, because the flaw with my last brayer was it was very top heavy and wouldn't sit on the table very well. And so now with a handle like this with the wide base, it can sit on the table just as well. And instead of trying to make my own handle from a dowel rod, I was just going to buy a handle that you put on the end of a file and just slap it onto the pieces of brass. And that was my brayer. And you know what? This actually works really well. It looks great. And it's way lighter than my last brayer. But I couldn't help but think, if I'm going to teach people how to do this, people aren't going to want to buy a $12 piece of brass and a $5 handle to spend, $17 to make a handle for this. 3D printers are cheap. 3D printers as in the people who 3D print are cheap, and we like to get away with 3D printing as much as possible. So I decided maybe I'll design a handle. So for the handle, I went with this weird shape for a few reasons. One, I really liked the way that the tackish kind of brayers sit on their sides, and so I can have it sit just like this, and the roller's not going to touch the table. That's perfect. but then you flip it around, and then now you have most of the brayer exposed, and you can start printing with it. But I wanted to for sure this to print in one part. That's a little bit tricky because the tacky sprayer has a round handle, and if you've ever tried to print a cylinder on its side with 3D printing, you know it doesn't work out very well. But luckily, 3D printers do print hexagons pretty well, and that way it has less contact area on the bottom, all the layer lines are going in the strongest direction for the print, and there's no need for supports at all, so that also minimizes plastic waste and post-processing. So once you've printed your core, you're going to need to print yourself 1 to 2 of these acrylic tube holders. I'll show you why you might need the second one soon. And so basically it's just got a hole in the bottom for you to send that screw through, and your acrylic tube is going to sit right flush in the middle of there. If it doesn't quite fit like a nice tight seal, you can take packing tape and wrap it around your acrylic tube, and that's just going to bring it up a little bit more thickness, and that way hopefully you'll get a snug fit. And the rubber doesn't stick to packing tape very well, so it's also good mold release for the outside too. Luckily for me, mine snap in just perfectly because I designed them, but you might have to mess with your tolerances a little bit. If you're planning on printing to the very top of the tube, that's when you'll need your second acrylic tube holder, and that's just going to center it across the top too, so that way your core is parallel to the outside tube. If you're going to print something smaller than the whole length of the tube, you're going to print one of these little spacer things. And so what that's going to do is going to kind of slot into the top hole there, and the width of this spacer is the inside of the tube, and so it'll kind of hold it centered in there just like that. Go ahead and print yourself off one of these. It's going to help you push the acrylic tube off of the roller and print off another core. This one right here I think is an 8-inch core, and that'll also help us get the tubes out. Very important. Now once you've got all of those 3D printed, let's go ahead and prepare a mold for some rubber. And for me personally, I don't exactly like clean out the inside of the tubes. I do take a towel and I wipe all of the lint and all of like the little like flecks of rubber that are trapped in there, but I don't degrease it and I don't use solvents in there. I kind of leave the old layer of grease in there, but whatever motion that you'd use to clean it will reflect as a texture on your brayer. And so I'm doing this very purposeful, like sideways kind of like rotating motion, and that way it'll kind of create like horizontal lines on my brayer. If you do kind of pronounced like vertical lines, it'll definitely kind of show up in your brayer sometimes. So let's go ahead and grab our acrylic tubes, the acrylic tube holders, our spacer, and our mold release, and take it outside for a quick spray in. Now I'm pretty lazy, and so I just shake my mold release can and I give it kind of like 2 layers of mold release. So there's one for that one for that one. I do a spray into the tube, kind of hefty spray. I let it sit for like 10 seconds or so, and then I go ahead and I flip it around and I hit it with another spray. And after I've done that, I usually give it about a minute, and then I'll do that one more time, so it kind of has 2 coats of it. And once you've done that, go ahead and take it back inside and you're ready to mold. We're going to start by grabbing our core and we're going to screw it to the acrylic tube holder. And so this is designed to just have a pretty good kind of friction fit, and there's no threads in this design, and so you're just going to kind of make your own threads. And so I like to start by screwing in the screw through the acrylic tube holder just until the tip peeks out, and then I go ahead and line that tip up with the kind of hole on the core, and then we're going to go ahead and tighten the 2 things together. And you'll probably hear a little bit of cracking. That's kind of normal, especially if you use silk PLAs. Those are a bit more brittle than just kind of like regular plain covered PLAs. But you're going to want to give this a really tight grip, and you're going to want it to be so tight that there's pretty much like no wobble or play between the core and the base. And then after that, go ahead and slide your acrylic tube over top of it. Make sure that it's all the way flush to the bottom. And for me, I usually do about 3 at a time. I found that 3 is kind of the maximum you can kind of work with because of the pot light of the rubber. After I'm starting to pour my second one, you can really feel that the rubber is really thick for that third one. Now let's go ahead and get our measuring cup and our stirring sticks and our rubber out. And so I know you're supposed to mix in 2 separate containers, but I like to mix mine in the same one so I don't have to clean 2 containers. And so we're going to go ahead and pour out the B, give it a good stir before you pour it out so all the catalyst is, not sitting at the bottom. And for every inch of brayer that I'm going to pour of rubber, I'm going to need about 28 milliliters of rubber total. And then I usually add on an extra kind of like 20 milliliters of rubber after that, because we're going to overflow the mold a little bit, and just in case we miss the mold and some spills out the side. Next we're going to add some dye, and I usually add about 1 drop per inch of rubber I'm about to cast. Mix it all quite thoroughly together, and then we're going to add our A part. This one mixes 1 to 1, and so I'm just going to match how much I poured down in the first half, and then mix it very, very thoroughly together. You don't want it to have any kind of clumps of just A or just B part, because then you'll just get like a weird pockets of goop when you demold your brayer. And so mix it very thoroughly. Don't forget to scrape the sides too. That's very, very important. And scrape pretty much like every inch of the bottom with your spoon. And I'm going to be mixing this for maybe like 2 or 3 minutes. You don't want to let it sit for too long or it's going to start setting up. And then you're going to pour it in a very thin stream, and that way it'll kind of force all of the air bubbles out to the side. If you're lucky enough to have enough extra walls, I like to tilt it a little bit like this and pour in a good majority of the rubber, and some of it's going to overflow out onto the top of the core. That's not a huge deal. If it flows into the hole for the screw, that's not a huge deal either. It just means you can't see it when you're trying to align the things later, but it'll come out later. Now the rubber actually either shrinks a little bit or it degasses. I'm not quite sure which of the two, but if you fill it up exactly to the edge of your brayer, it's gonna like shrink a little bit and you're not gonna have enough to go over the top of your brayer. And so you're gonna want to overflow it a little bit, and so you can kind of see I like overfilled it and I've got enough rubber to kind of cover the outsides of it. Very important. And now for this one, since I didn't go all the way to the top of the tube, I'm going to use the spacer, and there's a hole in the back of the spacer for me to insert a screw. And so I'm just going to insert a screw into the back and just kind of leave it halfway out, and this is just going to be like my handle so I can kind of pull it in and push it out later. And so hopefully, if you printed it right, it should fit exactly into your tube. And you're going to want the little nub at the bottom to fit exactly into that core. And so you might feel that you missed it, but once you know that you've got the core lined up, press it in, but don't press it in all the way. We don't want to squish the rubber because that means air bubbles have nowhere to go. But you just want to get it so it's aligned and holding it centered. For shorter brayers, it's usually not a big deal, but for the longer, like 6 inches or 7-inch ones you make, it's going to start being a sort of a big deal as your core tilts ever so slightly to the right or left. So here I'm just going to pour my other 2 brayers. And if you're pouring multiple brayers, you want to work fast because it gets thicker as it goes on and it gets harder to pour, and more of it's going to spill out the edge. And the last thing you want to do is run out of rubber because you spilled too much over the edge. Like I did here, I ran out of rubber, and so I had to quickly mix up a second batch, and splicing 2 batches together doesn't usually quite work out too well. It's not ideal, but it can be done. And you'll want to add your second batch while they're both still wet and active. If I try to add a second batch on top of it once it's dried, it usually has a seam, and once you kind of like rub the brayer hard against that seam, it'll start to separate. So mix up your second batch and add it while it's still fresh. So here, this one's poured up to the top, and so I'm going to go ahead and show how I use the other kind of acrylic tube holder to align the top. And so thread the screw all the way through, and I'm just going to have it into where that screw just finds the tip of the top of it, and then the sides of the wall just kind of grip the outside of the case, but I don't want to push this down flush. And so here I'm just going to give it like 1 turn just to reassure myself that I've found the hole, and that's it. I would definitely want an air pocket above the brayer. If you don't have an air pocket, air bubbles collect in random spaces down below in the sides of the walls of the brayer, so not ideal. And don't worry why that one has holes in it, that was just a prototype. And this rubber has a 16-hour demolding time, and so that gives it time for all the air bubbles to kind of rise out of it. And so to demold, we're just going to go ahead and take out our screws, and it's going to be a bit tough, but luckily the rubber doesn't like to stick to the PLA too much. And go ahead and pull out the topper, and so you can see here I probably could have used a little bit more rubber. And the bottom one, you're just going to really have to grip it out. Sometimes a little bit more mold release around the side of the tube also helps. I think a little bit of rubber squeezed through that crack between the tube and the PLA up the sides of the walls, and it's just kind of holding it together. Now this is a good sign where you can see there's not very much rubber on the bottom. You can clearly see the bottom of your core, very defined. That'll be easy to process. And luckily for the deep one, we still have that screw in there, and that screw kind of helps us pull that back out. A little bit of a twist also helps if it's a little bit stuck. Now this is where we'll need that spare core and the tube ejector. So go ahead, take your spare core, put it on the table, and you're going to slide your mold over top of it. And the tube ejector, the side that has a little lip on it, it's designed so that it'll grip the acrylic tube, but it'll have enough space for your brayer to kind of push through the center of it. So go ahead and put it over and push down really hard. And so you'll see right here, it's starting to demold, which is great. And if you really can't get it out and you have a woodworking vise, I have found that if you get your tube and the tube ejector and a shallower spare core, you can kind of force it to go a little bit of the way through. And once you've kind of broken that seal and you got air in there, you can push it the rest of the way through. But what I actually want to do is push it out to the kind of rougher, uglier side out first, and we're going to trim the edge of this brayer while it's still in the tube. And so I'm going to push it back through the uglier side first, so usually the top side, and I'm going to push it out so that the excess rubber is outside the top of the tube, but I'm going to try and get the core to be in line with the edge of the acrylic tube so I can cut it flush. And this one, I didn't have enough rubber, and so it didn't quite make it all the way to the top of the core, and so I have to cut it a little bit thin on the inside. And so I'm going to show you how I trim the edges of this. So grab your box cutter with the blade fully extended, and I'm going to use the edge of the acrylic tube as a fence for my blade, and so that way it'll kind of keep my blade perpendicular with the straight edge of the tube. And I'm going to go ahead and slowly rotate the tube and slice all the way down. And this only really works if I'm going to slice kind of into the core, because that way the rubber can kind of push back against the core and it's not super floppy. If there's not a core behind where I'm slicing, it tends to be kind of jagged, and so it really is just a practice thing to kind of guess how far out you push the tube and how far you trim while still having that core behind your knife. And sometimes you get it better than the others. Sometimes I get it spot on, sometimes I trim a little too much, but as long as it's symmetrical on both sides, I think that's what's prettiest and what really matters. And so you're just gonna keep going until like you've made so many passes around that you feel like you've hit the whole thing, and then go ahead and kind of pick at it and see if you see your core color coming through. And here I think I trimmed off an excess, like 1 millimeter off the inside, and that's not bad. And so I'm going to go ahead and push it through back to the other side, and I'm going to trim off an excess millimeter off of that side. And so really it's just kind of a practice game. And this is the best looking edge you can get, because I can't just take a miter saw and chop off the entire edge flush all at once, because the core, inside of this core is hollow, and it would be a very weird pattern if I just kind of sliced into it. And so I kind of need the ends of the 3D print to kind of keep it flush and protected. Now if you do get lucky and you manage to cut your rubber flush with the core, you can go ahead to the other side and just do this kind of neat trick to kind of clean up the rubber. And so I'm just going to take my fingernail and I'm going to really just kind of like scratch and pinch at that corner of the core. And since the rubber is so thin, my fingernail is just going to break it right there, kind of like a pair of scissors, right at the core. And just kind of work your way around, and that'll just kind of really give you a flush kind of edge to it. And then once you've kind of finished the core, you're going to go ahead and do the same thing with the little bit of flashing at the edge of the acrylic tube, and that's a pretty flush edge for the core. And at one point I did try just using the core as like a flush surface and bending my box cutter and hoping that was parallel and just sawing my way through the rubber, but it ended up giving you like really jagged edges. Here you can see, and it's not exactly very flush or perpendicular. And I also tried sawing while it was still in the tube, but that also gives you like all these really weird kind of lines that go all the way around it. It works better for sure, but it's not nearly as pretty as what I settled upon. And once you've got your handle printed, it's time to assemble things. And this is by far the easiest part of all of it. We're just going to take our handle, lay it on its side, put our core in there, and then just kind of screw it in. And you're just going to screw it until it's about flush with the handle, but you don't want to make it too tight so that it doesn't churn. So if it's too tight and the roller doesn't want to churn, just kind of back it off a little bit until you have a free spinning roller in your brayer handle. It really is as simple as that. Now, I just need to assemble the rest of these. So what I really like about these brayers is, one, look at all these beautiful colors that you can have. Secondly, it sits on the table really well. Like, it's kind of hard to tip over. I mean, it tips over a little bit, but it'll always want to be on its handle side. And it's super light, like way lighter than any of my other brayers. I feel like it's very comfortable to hold. And I really like this kind of diamond hexagon shape that I have. It really nestles into that V of my fingers, and so it kind of forces me to use it this way. I think it's comfortable. It's comfortable when I'm rolling it out just kind of the traditional way, and even when I'm doing the kind of overhand grip, rolling it upside down, it's also very comfortable to hold. And this big flat base right here is just kind of good for me to rest my palm upon. Another big deal for me is that you can print it in PLA, polylactic acid, which is a bioplastic often made from cornstarch and sugarcane, so it's very sustainable. And for the best reason, PLA is resistant to most petrochemicals. And so I can clean up using my good old mineral oil or baby oil or even mineral spirits, and it doesn't really degrade the plastic. Traditional plastics like ABS usually get a lot of degradation if you hit them with things like acetone or other solvents. But PLA, man, I could clean this with mineral spirits, and just in general, our inks just don't really like to stick to it, and so if your brayer gets dirty and you hit it quick enough, you could just wipe it off with a dry towel in general. Unfortunately, because of the layer lines, when you 3D print things, sometimes those layer lines just kind of hold ink because our towels can't get in there. And so what I'll do, if I really want to deep clean, is I can just run it under the sink, use a little bit of Bon Ami or Barkeeper's Friend, and just kind of scrub at it, and that'll usually get all of the deep stains out of the plastics. Now, I've gone on and on about how awesome these brayers are, but I know not everyone's going to want to go out and make their own brayers because you don't have a 3D printer, or it's just not worth the investment cost if you just want one or two brayers. And so that's why I made so many. I will be selling some of these brayers. Just message me on Instagram or look at my website. I'll have some pre-made ones up for there, but message me if you want a custom color and we can see what we can work out. And I know I can't sell these brayers to the whole world or to everybody, and so that's why I'm leaving all of the files and the STLs up for download on my printables, so you can download the parts and make them yourself. And I'll leave links to some of the other supplies in the description. So I hope you all make yourself some better brayers than those tiny, really cheap ones. So if I helped you out today, leave a like. I put a lot of time into this video because I had to learn how to 3D model and learn how to 3D print, and so yeah, it'll kind of show me a little bit of appreciation for all this hard work I put into this. Anyway, I'll see you next time. Keep on printing. Nick out.
Ah.